Hello, my name is Julia Bunnemann. I'm the curator at Photoworks and I'm talking to Tamsin Green today. Tamsin, thank you so much for having us in your studio. You are a London-based artist working with photographer. You're also designing books. You founded Manual Edition as well as the Sustainable Photobook Publishing Network. Your work is very much focused on nature, on materialities, on the intersection of human life with the earth, on sourcing the right materials. Yes, maybe you can take us on your journey a bit about your work and start.
Yes, so thank you for coming to my home today to have this conversation. And yes, I mean it's a big question, and my work, I've come to photography quite organically from another industry, and I think for me photography has really been about learning both about myself and about the world around me, and that has been very naturally through walking and spending time in different types of landscapes and trying to understand the relationship between humans and the living world and how that has played out over time and throughout history. So the first body of work that I made was about salt, and it was really about trying to figure out where salt comes from, and that was also thinking about the fact that our current consumer culture, we very much have a material blindness about where things come from and how things are made. And so the project was about really going to the source of salt and thinking about how salt has been very much connected to the development of civilization. So the first settlements in Europe developed in places where salt was naturally occurring, because humans have always needed to find salt. It's an essential mineral for our lives. So these were the first human interventions in the landscape, was really extracting salt. So the project was about exploring what those landscapes look like, but also how, because of that connection to civilization, how salt has been connected also through language and the sayings that we have, especially in the English language, around salt, and how those things become embedded together. And when I was then working with that material, making the photographs, I was then thinking about how they come into the book form, thinking about the colours that I experienced in those landscapes and the textures of the mineral itself. How could you bring those encounters into the medium of the book?
Yeah.
And so all of that thinking around both making work by walking in the landscape, but also materiality and how an audience could experience some of those responses to the places that I was visiting, I was exploring within the book. And so those two things started to come together, and I think that has paved the way for a lot of the work that I've made since, where I've really been exploring these dualities of walking and bookmaking, and how they come together in a project.
And you mentioned bookmaking, so what is quite interesting in your work is that bookmaking is actually quite a crucial part of the work. So we see it's becoming a book. And do you think first of the book, or is that kind of how you see it, or is there a single image coming first? It's like, how does this come together?
Yes, so I do think about books right from the start. I think books provide a structure, and they provide a physical space for something to occur. And so the work is very much made in parallel to the process of making the photographic work. So I'm testing things, printing them out on paper, playing with structures and folding, and through doing this I figure out what the project is about, and what's missing. And also a key part of that is also showing those tests and maquettes and book dummies to other people, because books are always need to be activated by a reader. So seeing the response to those early tests and also throughout the project is also fed back into my making process. So it's a very iterative way of working, which is very much connecting all of these different parts of the process together.
And sourcing the materials as well, kind of like where about, and if it's kind of like in terms of paper and you mentioned in a previous conversation that you would include paper from kind of you look within the UK, but also kind of like from outside. So that's kind of from Italy, I think, kind of like or kind of like bringing these elements into printmaking and different ways of showcasing the works as well.
Yes, so I think I'm very conscious about where materials come from and the processes that I'm using. And so I think when we're making photographic work and when we're making books, we are entangling ourselves in these extraction and production processes which have historically been harmful to the living world. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And so within my own practice, I'm trying to design out waste and the use of harmful minerals and materials, and I'm trying to be very conscious about the materials that I choose to use. I do extensive research on where things are coming from and how they are made, and then I make conscious choices about which materials are right for a particular project, but that will always be on an individual book basis. So with the salt work that I was making, that was the first photo book that I made, and with that project I was sourcing all of the papers from a paper mill in Sweden, which is Munken. And it's a very sustainably run mill. They're making very conscious choices about how they generate energy, how they manage water within the paper making process, which is very, very water intensive. But then that paper has to be transported to the UK in order for us to use it. So with the next book that I worked on, I wanted to see if I could make a photo book just with all materials made in the UK. So I worked with paper from a mill in the Lake District, which is called James Cropper Mill, which is where a lot of G.F. Smith papers are made. So all of the papers for that project were made here. And with other projects that I've worked on since then, I've been thinking about, for example, what if we don't always have to use trees to make paper? Are there other things that go into the making of paper that could free us from the connection with forests? So on the recent book I was working with a paper that was made by Favini, which is a paper maker in Italy, and they are extracting toxic algae from the lagoon of Venice and transforming this toxic material into the fibres for paper. So with that project, it was about lichen, which is a symbiosis between algae and fungi, and it became really interesting to think about how I could use this paper and bring in the materiality of the algae, and also open up a question about the ingredients that are used to make paper, and how do photographs look when they're on these different types of paper. That paper has a very different tactility to some of the other papers that I'd worked with, and seeing how the paper and the images come together is also a really exciting thing, and something that I'm very interested in my work. I'm not very excited often about my images on the screen, but I've become really interested when the images are paired and grouped together, and when they come into the physical world through the materiality of paper and textiles and other things.
Yeah, in a three-dimensional space a bit, no? And that's kind of really interesting because you're not a trained photographer, you actually studied architecture. How does this influence your work?
Yeah, so I did train as an architect, and I worked as an architect for almost 18 years. And I think that there's a lot of things that I bring from that background in architecture, but one of the key things I think has been thinking like a designer. So as an architect you have to draw everything, and in order to do that you have to really understand how you're going to make something. You know, are you going to be using metal sheet? Are you going to be extruding something? Are you welding? Are you mechanically fixing? Are you going to be preforming something, or are you going to be bending something on site? And you really have to be thinking through all of those elements of materiality and making in order to be able to design something and draw it in a way that somebody else can make it. And another key part of that is that you're always working with a lot of other people. So you're working both with a design team, but then you've also got engineers, you've got the people who are going to be using the building. They could be scientists, they could be people who work in retail, you know, it could be many different types of people. So you've also got that group of people that you're talking to, and then you've also got the people who are making the building. So you're talking to suppliers, you're talking to manufacturers. So this background in design has really made me think about both working in an interdisciplinary way and talking to people about all those different steps of design and making process, and feeding all of those things back into how you think about what you're making. And I think that's very much comes through, especially when I'm making books, in thinking about all of the individual components, how they come together, thinking about things like paper sizes and how the book size fits the paper size, and how you can reduce how much waste you're ending up with through that process. How many books
which is often
you're
forgotten
making
as well, no? Kind of like in terms of waste.
Absolutely. So I think all of these things are coming from my background in design, and are feeding their way back into the way that I work with photography. Yeah,
and that's I think that's kind of like really interesting, kind of like then when you look at your practice and kind of like coming from books, but also with a three-dimensional element to it. It's very tactile, as you said before, and thinking then of exhibition making, and I wonder how they are kind of like connected to you, kind of, because, you know, book, if you read through a book, it's often linear and you need to think of a certain edit, but it's a bit different if you think of a three-dimensional space to it.
Absolutely. I think exhibitions are something that's quite new within my photography practice, and I think that's partly because I was working with books and I wasn't sure why I would make exhibitions, and why I would work in both mediums, and it's taken time for me to think about how an exhibition can be complementary to the making of the book, and I've never been interested in replicating something in multiple formats, but really thinking about what a medium can do that's specific to itself. So for me, exhibitions have become a very complementary way of exploring work, which enables you to deal with things like scale, also different types of materiality. I've been working in recent exhibitions quite a lot with fabrics, as something that also can move and is more fluid often than paper, and also thinking about bringing the process of bookmaking into the exhibition space. So recent exhibition that I just had in Swansea was a process-based show with two other artists, Folium and Gareth Phillips, and we were all exploring the process of making kind of bookworks within the exhibition space, and it was a way of bringing in byproducts and waste materials of the bookmaking process and transforming them through overprinting and collage and appropriating them to create new works, which is something that I couldn't have explored within the book, because it's come about through the bookmaking that these things exist. And so bringing those elements into an exhibition space, but then also combining them with images that can be at scale, you can create new connections and dialogues between elements of the work and the process, which complement the content of the book and the story that that book might tell. So I've really come to think about these things as very complementary, but often the book will come first, and then the exhibition is exploring elements of that which can be explored, like you say, within a physical space, and in a way that's not linear, that's more constellation and connection based.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Kind of like, and also kind of like when you mention the interdisciplinary work that you do often, because you're not also you're not only designing books for yourself and your own work, but you also for others, and you founded the Manual Editions as a publishing house. So and you can, maybe you can talk about this a bit and how this kind of like influencing each other's works.
Yes, so Manual Editions I developed it in 2021, and that was to coincide with the release of my second book. And at that time I was really thinking a lot about how we could grow a conversation about sustainability. And this was my first step, was to create a platform for both publishing my own work, but then also developing resources and research about this topic, which I felt was unexplored within photography. Yeah. And I think also coming from this background of design, sustainability is very much embedded into all of the steps of making and designing and production. And coming from that background, I was very aware that this just wasn't part of the dialogue about making artistic work, where it's often focused on the output and the artistic idea, but there was very little discussion about, or accountability about how things are being made and transported. And so I really wanted to open up that conversation, and that's where Manual Editions came from, and later the Sustainable Photobook Publishing network, as ways to start connecting with other people who are making work, and create dialogue around these issues.
And that's quite important now, kind of like to create this dialogue and to learn also from each other, because there's this, I mean, if you think of sustainability and you want to make it right, but there are always pros and cons and things that you need to consider. So it is actually quite nice to share the knowledge, what you're doing, and kind of like share it from others as well, with the Sustainable Photobook Publishing Network. And it kind of reflects also a bit like some curatorial work that you do, kind of bringing the books together and the research you've done. And I think that's very valuable for others, kind of like who are thinking, kind of like, how can I start and how can I be more conscious about producing work within the sector of photography, but also within bookmaking.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think there can be an attitude of kind of competition among practitioners, and I think especially within these fields of like environmental consciousness, it's really important to work together and to share information. And I think that's the only way that we can help each other to move in a more responsible direction. So for me, that comes with sharing information in a generous and open way. And I think starting the Sustainable Photobook Publishing Network, it's grown very organically. There was no real idea about what it would become. So it started with just informal conversations with other practitioners. But through that, the network has grown to be now, I mean, there's several hundred people connected with the network who are sharing information, and so we've become a kind of a place where this information and knowledge can exist, and people who are interested in working this way can access that information. And then I was also aware that all of this information was existing digitally. So we have a page on the Manual Editions website where case studies and resources are shared, and we also have an Instagram account. But through these medium, you can't engage with the tactility and the materiality of these books that we were talking about. So more recently, we've had an exhibition of these case study books that talk about individual books, how they were made, and through showing them in an exhibition format, people can actually see the physical size of them. They can touch these papers. What do those choices feel like or look like? But it's also a way of really seeing how incredible these books are, and that sustainability isn't something that's about compromise, but it can also be about creative opportunities and making books that are different through thinking differently about materials and sizes and formats. So that's also been a really important part of the exhibition, is really showing that it's not about giving up things, or it doesn't have to be that, but it can be, you know, you're still making incredible creative works, but being responsible about how you're doing that.
Yeah. Tamsin, thank you so much for kind of like showcasing all the different things that you do and giving us like an insightful talk about your work as well. We go on now and have a look at the studio.
Thank you very much.